Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Nadine Strossen, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast. So before we start the show, I wanted to let you know that I'm really excited to speak with you, and there's a lot to get into. So I want to skip the introduction. Everything will be mentioned on the description for my podcast, but I wanted to start with this book that I read, which is great. And early in the acknowledgments of that book, you mentioned your father, Woodrow Strossen, and who survived Buchenwald and later moved to the United States, and the rest is history, as they say. How did that experience shape who you ended up becoming in life?
Stanley, first of all, thank you so much for having read my book and enjoyed it. And secondly, thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about my beloved father, who was a huge and remains a huge source of inspiration. Sadly, he died in 1999. But the fact that he was a Holocaust survivor has no doubt made me even more sensitive than I hope I otherwise would have been to any kind of discrimination or oppression on the basis of identity, who you are. But I also, because of my father's experience and experience of other family members, also have been very sensitive to discrimination and oppression based on what you believe. My father was persecuted by the Nazis not only because of his Jewish background, but also because of his anti Nazi advocacy and crusading. So he was punished both for his identity and for his ideas. And I am eternally grateful to the United States for providing at least the ideals and the legal tools to try to foster ideals of full fundamental freedoms for all of us, no matter who we are and no matter what we believe. And I'm happy to have had the opportunity to work for those goals throughout my career.
Mm-hmm. What would you say the most important lesson that you learned from your father?
I would say the most important lesson is how much difference one individual can make, and that we all have a responsibility to speak up and to do whatever we possibly can to oppose injustice wherever it occurs. My goodness, he did it in a circumstance where he ended up losing his liberty, having been imprisoned in a concentration camp, a forced labor camp. He almost lost his life. For those of us who have much less at stake, right? We may be subject to ostracism or criticism, but I don't think we face a realistic chance of imprisonment in this country. That makes our responsibility to speak up and to be active against injustice and even more important responsibility that we have no excuse to shun.
And does that, in your mind, extend to other parts of society besides, if somebody is experiencing hate or not? How about if you disagree with a certain political orthodoxy that exists in, say, a university or your, wherever you work, or is it, or do you have a responsibility to say something, even though you risk potentially losing your job without any explanation, or having, in some situations, I've heard grades lowered in certain colleges?
Stanley, you are asking a very difficult question, which I wrestle with all the time. I speak from a position of great security. I'm older, far along in my career. I've been a tenured professor, so with unprecedented job security. People in my position have no excuse for not speaking up. But when we talk about younger people who are less secure economically, less secure professionally, less secure as a matter of their own individual self-confidence for understandable reasons, I would never preach to somebody that they should risk their economic security, their professional reputation, or even friendships and social networks. So the part of my students, for example, they're law students. Every survey shows that law students, other graduate students, and undergraduates, and certainly younger students, the biggest fear in their life and the biggest source of pressure is peer pressure. They are not afraid of being punished by government officials. They're not afraid of being punished by teachers or professors. They're afraid that they're going to be ostracized and stigmatized by their peers. And I would never wish on any young person that enormous unhappiness. And unfortunately, if we look at studies about the psychological problems that students are experiencing, there are record rates of depression and anxiety, and tragically, record numbers of suicides among young people. So that becomes especially incumbent on people in my position with more security to speak out on behalf of those who don't have the luxury of being relatively safe in speaking out, to do our best to try to change the culture so that these kinds of punitive responses either don't happen or aren't effective when they do happen. And certainly if somebody does choose to speak out, which I certainly applaud, then the rest of us have a responsibility to support that person, whether we, and that is true even if we disagree with the person's perspective. But what we want to support is what I think your question got to, and that is to raise different perspectives, to dare to ask questions, even indeed, especially of the most established orthodoxies of our day. That's really ultimately our responsibility as citizens in a free society.
Yeah, beyond professors, standing up for their students, or ensuring that everyone has the right to say whatever is on their mind. Is there anything else society could do that would create a more hospitable environment for people to speak up?
I think that all of us, both in educational institutions, but in larger society, have to constantly educate ourselves and others and inform people about the importance of free speech and civil discourse and open inquiry, to explain that this is not only a matter of individual liberty, which is very important, the right of each of us to make our own decisions about what ideas and information we will convey. It's also the right of the rest of us to choose what ideas and information we will receive. And this kind of free-flowing discourse is absolutely the lifeblood of our democratic republic, where we the people, I'm quoting the opening words in the Constitution, we the people wield sovereign power. We cannot do that responsibly unless we are able to freely, candidly, frankly, vigorously, robustly debate, especially the most sensitive issues, right? Precisely because they are so important. How can we shape public policy effectively otherwise? I'm very disturbed when I see, sorry, I'm gonna stop there. I'm going on and on, so I'm asking you to ask me another question.
Oh, no. Please don't feel the need to stop. It's
Okay. Well, now I've lost my train of thought, so I'm really
well,
sorry. You're gonna have to edit that. I'm really sorry.
no, it's
Let's want
okay.
to ask me a follow-up question, but I felt like I was going on too long.
No, not at all. But uh, one of the things I saw when researching for this podcast was I watched a debate that you were in about 20 some odd years ago on Firing Line with William Buckley.
Oh,
And I think the topic of the conversation is the ACLU
Full of baloney.
full of baloney. And there was a gentleman by the name of Lino Grigaglia who was,
Ralia.
yeah,
Mhm.
who was debating you, and he was going on about, how the ACLU and, you in particular defended flag burning and pornography and other left-wing ideologies. Sometimes it feels to me that parties have flipped a little bit,
Mhm.
where people on the left are less likely to defend free speech, while
Mhm.
people on the right are now more likely to defend free speech. No, I'm not saying all free speech, because I think people on the left will still defend, right for flag burning and
Mhm.
pornography and all that, and the right will always kind of find that a little,
Mhm.
uh, find something wrong with that. Um, but do you see that the has anything really changed since the debate 20 some odd years ago?
Throughout my adult lifetime, Stanley, nothing really has changed in terms of people's attitudes toward free speech. The vast majority of people are more or less result oriented. They love defending their own free speech. They love defending free speech for people whose ideas they approve of, and they're much less likely to support free speech for ideas that they deeply disapprove of. So um, throughout my activism with the ACLU, there have been many free speech battles where predominantly conservatives were on our side, and many free speech battles where predominantly liberals were on our side, depending on which speech was being suppressed and which was being protected in any particular situation. I've seen public opinion polls to this day that show that kind of disparity. The Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in Washington, did such a survey a year or two ago, and it showed very consistent with the examples you gave that conservatives think that protesting the flag in any way, either by taking a knee or by burning it, anything that's unpatriotic, they're more in favor of censorship, whereas liberals are much more in favor of censoring something that they see as being antithetical to racial justice or gender justice. So they're more supportive of censoring hate speech. But there are very few people who will even handedly say, we will defend free speech for all of the above, no matter how much we disagree with the particular idea or message.
Yeah, maybe to play devil's advocate for a second, maybe the difference between taking a knee
Mhm.
and burning a flag. But taking a knee, you don't, maybe the person stands in opposition to the country, but there are other good explanations perhaps you can give for why somebody might take a knee,
Mhm.
racial injustice or et cetera, et cetera. When you burn a flag, some people would say, well, that's treason,
Mhm.
because that's the symbol of freedom and a symbol of this country and liberation. And if you don't like it so much, well, get out. Um, is there is it the same? Are those two things, taking a knee and burning a flag, the same, or is there a major distinction when it comes to free speech?
I don't care it, first of all, it's not treason. There is a specific definition in the Constitution for treason. It requires an actual act of aiding the enemy and so forth. So I think what you're using that term loosely, which I defend your right to do that, as anything that is arguably unpatriotic or showing disrespect for the United States, right? And that's exactly how people see burning the American flag. And even if your message is, I hate the United States, and I think that we need to have another revolution or a completely new form of government, that is constitutionally protected speech. And this has been in the news quite a bit lately since January 6th, because most people have been following that controversy and whether the speech that allegedly instigated insurrection was or was not constitutionally protected, know that the standard to punish speech, even speech that is advocating the overthrow of the United States government is constitutionally protected. So we're not talking only about the ACLU's position here. We're talking about the Supreme Court unanimously, way back in 1969, it was an ACLU case, I'm very proud, said that even advocacy of lawless or violent conduct is constitutionally protected. What is not protected is intentional incitement of imminent violence or lawlessness, where the violence or lawlessness is likely to happen imminently. In other words, the speech poses an emergency. There's no other way to prevent great harm, violence, or lawlessness other than suppressing the speech. So censorship is only a last resort. And as the Supreme Court held in its two flag burning cases, burning the American flag, no matter how offensive it is to people, no matter, even if the person is burning the flag precisely to advocate the overthrow of the US government, that's still constitutionally protected. And I think that's correct, Stanley. It may seem counterintuitive, but when you think of the alternative of giving the government more discretionary power to punish speech when there's a more indirect, speculative connection between the speech and potential harm, that's too dangerous, because that gives the government discretion to punish ideas that it dislikes, to punish speakers that it disfavors, to suppress organizations or groups or movements that are politically unpopular or powerless. So before 1969, we had a standard in this country, which many other countries still enforce, called the bad tendency or harmful tendency standard, when speech might at some point in the future indirectly cause certain harm, then the speech could be punished. Well, under that standard, essentially all speech could be punished. As Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, every idea is an incitement. And by that, he didn't mean that therefore we should punish all ideas, but exactly the opposite. If the fact that speech might incite some violent or negative action was enough to censor it, then we'd have no free speech left at all.
Yeah. Would you, I completely agree with you, but would you, is there something that is beyond the pale when it comes to free speech?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say that, because when I say that the ACLU and I personally defend all free speech, no matter whether it's coming from the extreme left or the extreme right or anything in between, what I meant by that was summed up by the Supreme Court in a phrase that viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. The government may never censor speech solely because of disagreement with the viewpoint, the content, the message, the idea of the speech, no matter how hated or hateful that message may be, and no matter how deeply despised by no matter what a high percentage of our population, disagreement or disapproval with the idea alone is never enough to justify censoring it. But when you get beyond the content of the speech and you look at its context, if in the particular factual circumstances, speech directly causes or threatens certain specific, serious, imminent harms, then it can and should be punished. That principle is often described as the emergency principle. When speech presents an emergency, some danger is immediately going to happen. There's nothing you can do to prevent the harm other than punishing the speaker, then government is justified in doing that. And the Supreme Court has recognized several subcategories of speech that do satisfy the emergency principle. One I referred to already, intentional incitement of imminent lawless or violent conduct that's likely to happen imminently. Another one is what the courts call a true threat, not the loose way we use the word threat in everyday speech, but where the speaker is targeting one person or a small group of people and intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of that audience that they will be subject to harm. The speaker doesn't have to intend to carry out the harm, just intend to instill a fear, and it has to be a reasonable fear, which is an objective standard, not a subjective one. And when you think about that, even if the speaker doesn't actually carry out the threatened harm, the mere fact that you reasonably fear that the speaker will do that is causing you harm. That means you're not going to exercise your free speech rights. You're not going to even exercise your free speech, your right to be out in public. You're probably going to run away from the threatening speaker. Targeted bullying and harassment are other examples of speech that satisfy the emergency principle. So when you think about it, the First Amendment principles that the court has created starting in the mid 20th century really are very a matter of common sense. They do allow government to bar the speech that poses the greatest danger, but they bar the government from the censorship that poses the greatest danger, right? When government is targeting disfavored ideas and disfavored speakers, that's the most dangerous form of censorship in our democracy.
Mhm. How about a situation like Skokie or um, Charlottesville most recently? You have Nazis marching down the street saying, well, in Charlottesville, for example, you have people saying Jews will not replace us. Um, why should that be allowed? Even though
So
they're technically threatening people.
they were not technically threatening people. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to. And I often use this example, Stanley, to illustrate the difference between protected speech and punishable speech under our legal system. When the Unite the Right demonstrators were seeking to demonstrate, despite the fact that the city at the last minute pulled their permit that had been granted months in advance, with testimony by members of the city council indicating that the reason that they were yanking the permit was because of disapproval of the ideas of the Unite the Right, which I certainly could not more strongly disapprove of those ideas. But that's a head-on violation of this viewpoint neutrality principle. And to add insult to injury, permits had already been granted to two different groups of counter demonstrators against the Unite the Right, and the city council did not pull their permits. So the ACLU argued, and the judge agreed that that was blatant viewpoint discrimination. That and the court has called the bedrock principle of our free speech system is mere disapproval of the ideas, no matter how loathsome the ideas, can never be a justification for censorship. At that hearing, by the way, I read the transcript. The police chief in Charlottesville said, no, there's no evidence that there's going to be any violence. There's no evidence of any conspiracy or plan to commit any kind of violence. Besides, we're completely prepared. And if there is any threatened violence, we will be able to provide protection. As we know, that turned out to not be true. None of the above was true. And when at the point that you had these marchers, even the night before the scheduled demonstration on August 17th, you may recall that they marched onto the property of the University of Virginia, where there were a group of counter demonstrators massed around a statue of Thomas Jefferson, and the Unite the Right were marching in military-like formation, confronting the counter demonstrators in a very menacing way, brandishing lighted tiki torches and other weapons. That, to me, clearly satisfies the legal standard of a punishable true threat. You ask yourself, if you're a counter demonstrator, would you reasonably feel that you were subject to harm, that you were being, you meant that and would these demonstrators, were they intentionally instilling a reasonable fear of harm on the part of the counter demonstrators? So there was a real failure of law enforcement to provide protection both that evening and the next day in the area where there was literal physical violence, which nobody would contend is protected free speech. Alex Field driving his car through, plowing it through peaceful counter demonstrators with not a single police officer in sight. That was just the most abysmal failure of law enforcement, as documented by a very thorough report that was commissioned, nonpartisan report commissioned by the city council after the fact.
Um, Maybe to bring it back to that debate from 20 years ago, there was a moment where a group of students were attempting to shut down some speakers and causing a fuss. I think you handled it with grace, and you told them that this is not the time or nor the place to do this, and they're not making any friends by doing this. Um, I saw that, looking back, as a microcosm of what's going on now. But it seems to me, I don't know if it's because of social media or because of the fact that we can literally see anything that goes on anywhere around the world, or the country. Are these kind of scenarios, are they more common than they were 20 years ago, or are they just about the same? It just seems like they're more common.
Stanley, that is such an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, but I think you really put your finger on it. That so if I can clue in the rest of your big podcast audience, during this debate took place at on a college campus. I'm blanking out on Bard College campus, and one of my debate partners was Leon Botstein, the then and still longtime president of Bard College. And some students were having a dispute with him. I can't remember what it was about. Could have been anything from we think our tuition should be lower to we should be able to take courses pass fail. I'm sorry.
Sorry, it was about the fact that they wanted diversity directors and
Oh, well, I was going to say it could have been something more substantive,
yeah.
getting beyond the students themselves. So, that's really interesting because that's an issue that continues to resonate today. And their way of raising the issue was to interrupt the debate, which was not only being done for a live audience, but as you alluded to, was being taped for television audience. Buckley had a regular show that was featured nationwide. And and the students mistakenly thought that they were exercising their free speech rights by using this opportunity to address not only the president of their college, but also potentially a nationwide audience. So I don't remember the details. You've looked at it infinitely more recently than I have, but what I would have done today, what I hope I did then, was to respectfully and civilly explain to them that there is a time and a place for them to raise their message, but it is not this. And this leads to another legitimate restriction on free speech, which is usually referred to as content neutral time, place, and manner regulations, right? No matter what these students had said, so it doesn't matter what the content of their speech was. This was not the time or the place to do it because it was interrupting the speech event that was taking place there, namely a debate on a totally different topic. So this is another example of how the restriction on the speech, stopping anybody from disrupting the event, does not raise a danger of suppression of ideas, right? That's not an idea suppressive purpose. And today, I don't think I know that kind of reasoned plea to many disruptors, including on college campuses, does not work. We've seen that over and over and over again. To me, one really shocking example was fairly soon after the Charlottesville tragedy in 2017, when the executive director of the ACLU of Virginia, Claire Gastañeda, was invited to her alma mater, the College of William and Mary, to discuss students' free speech rights. And before she could even begin talking, and this is all, of course, on YouTube, as most of these events are these days, a group of students that were identified as Black Lives Matter supporters came in with bullhorns and placards and other noise-making devices and just stopped her from speaking, stopped audience members from listening to her. She starts by saying something like, I applaud you for exercising your free speech. And that's the end. You can't hear anything else. Very tragically, you could see that some of the students in the audience who wanted to hear her tried to get out of their seats and to approach her at the podium so they could engage in a conversation with her. And the demonstrating students stopped that from happening as well. So you saw the double-barreled complete interference of free speech, not only the right of the speaker to speak, but the right of audience members to listen. And the demonstrators, by the way, were saying things like, hate speech is not free speech, and liberalism is racism, and things like that. ACLU, you would have defended Hitler too. And when the demonstrating students, disrupting students, posted with great pride their disruptive video, they bragged about shutting down the event and shutting down the ACLU. We've seen instances where college presidents, university presidents are shouted down in the middle of trying to address a forum, and no matter how much they try to plead or make to hear me, let other students hear me, the disruptors just don't give up. So I don't think my strategy would have worked today in many situations, Stanley. And when that happened to Claire in Virginia, I asked myself, what can you do in that kind of situation? And the only thing that I could think of was to always make sure that there's a whiteboard or a blackboard behind you, so that you could at least try to write a message there, but then presumably they could block audience members from viewing what you were writing.
Yeah, that perfectly leads to my next question, and that's, do we have an obligation to protect those that we disagree with most, more than our own side? If that makes sense.
I completely understand your question. It's a very important one. As a legal matter, organizations that defend free speech and individuals that defend free speech has an equal obligation to defend free speech, regardless of the viewpoint or the message. But from a moral and practical point of view, a strategic point of view, I think it is especially important for each of us to defend freedom, even for the thought that we hate, even for the thought that is diametrically opposed to our own views. And I would say, as you said, especially to do that, to underscore that what we are defending is a principle. We're not just defending a particular outcome that happens to accord with our policy preferences or our value preferences.
Yeah, the reason I asked was because, just as you were talking, we were discussing this. I thought of one of my dear friends. He attended Penn State, and during his time there, a conservative named Ben Shapiro spoke at the university, and he was shut down, and people yelled at him and whatnot. But there was clearly an audience that wanted to hear what he had to say. Some of which probably disagreed with him. They just, they were curious. And we had a conversation about that. I was like, you kind of have to stand up for those people. I mean, for Ben Shapiro. He goes, but I don't agree with Ben Shapiro. But I feel like the onus is more on people that disagree with him, because they can get through, in my opinion, to people that they on their side, to say, you know what, we might disagree with all his ideas, but the best way to dispel some of his ideas is to go and talk to him, ask him questions. And as Bill Maher always said on his podcast, on his show, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So you have to battle bad ideas, or in your opinion, bad ideas, with better ideas, not shut them down.
I completely agree. I would add one caveat, which is in any particular situation where somebody is preaching a message that you strongly disagree with, you have to think strategically, what am I trying to accomplish? What's the most effective way to accomplish it? I think when you're dealing with somebody like Ben Shapiro, who is highly intelligent, well-educated, articulate, by the way, he and I were co-panelists in testifying before Congress on campus free speech issues a few years ago, which is why I had the opportunity to hear him and to hear how lucid he is, and we completely agree on free speech principles. There, I agree with you. A rational debate and questions. I'm sure he would welcome that. And you know, let's not rule out the possibility that he might be able to persuade you. Not hook, line, and sinker, but there's nobody who's, even my own beloved husband, nobody I agree with 100% or disagree with 100%. But if you're talking about, let's say, a white supremacist organization that's out and out racist, you now understand how painful it was to me to hear those Unite the Right demonstrators chanting, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." There's not going to be a rational debate happening in those circumstances. And maybe the most effective way to try to diffuse attention from their message is to ignore them, right? Whenever there's a controversy, the news media shows up in great force and unwittingly, maybe not so unwittingly, gives more attention and necessarily more sympathy and amplification of this message. So if you're looking for a way to mute the message, maybe in some situations, you know, go away and have your own demonstration if you want to on another part of campus, have, you know, an affirmative celebration of values that you support, but don't give them the oxygen that they're seeking, which is attention.
Absolutely. Um, Probably would have been a good thing during Charlottesville if you just let them kind of go. In some ways, I think that's embarrassing, right? If nobody shows up, nobody sympathizes with you, they just ignore you, just go home. But I guess some people can't, hold back, and they
Resist the temptation. I mean, some
yeah,
people, and I understand if it
me too.
gives you some kind of moral satisfaction to be a counter demonstrator, but that's why I'm saying, but please try to be strategic. And it's not only me saying this, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which does a tremendous amount of work in this area, a couple of years ago released a guidebook to college students what to do when white supremacists or other extremists are coming to your campus. And over again, their message was, we understand the temptation to try to shut them down, to try to shout them down, to try to confront them. But we urge you, if you want to de-amplify their message, if that's your goal, rather than making yourself feel morally satisfied, then please don't use such confrontational, suppressive tactics.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I saw uh, not too long ago, there was a uh, the Dick Cavett show has all their, like, the archival interviews, and there's one interview with Lester Maddox, who was the governor of Georgia, who was a segregationist,
Mhm.
and he was on the show with Jim Brown, who was a football player and a civil rights activist, and he was African American himself, and Lester Maddox is white, and I was watching that debate or that conversation, and I go, this would never happen today. There's no way it would be this civil. This person is literally advocating for segregating white people and black people, and the black person in the room is just sitting there and trying to prove to him that his ideas are wrong.
Mhm.
And in a very civil manner, they never raised their voices, they never yelled at each other. And I'd be hard pressed to find a debate today um, that is that civil on an issue that tense.
Yet the leaders of the civil rights movement from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and historians who have studied how that movement ultimately became successful, stress over and over and over again how critically important it was that this was a peaceful, non-disruptive movement. That and King and all the others were so trained rigorously in the methods and tactics of nonviolence, so that even if they were confronted with physical violence, let alone insulting words, that they would withstand it with dignity and not respond in kind. And the verdict of history is that that was really essential to win over support for the movement from people in the rest of the country, that it was essential to their strategy for bringing about political change and legal change.
Yeah. Um, this also brings me to, I think, an important point. Um, it seems to me that politics in particular has infected most people's lives, and people have lost friends. They've lost, and some, I've heard of family members that don't want to talk to them because they're too, you know, to this or to that. Um, have we lost our ability to be friends with people on the other side of the aisle? Before you answer the question, I spoke recently with Edward Whelan, who was a former clerk for the late Justice Scalia, who I know you were friends with. And uh, on top of the question I asked before, can we be friends with people on the other side of the aisle? Uh, what Why were you friends with Antonin Scalia, even though you probably disagreed on 90% of the things you talked about?
I am fond of saying that Justice Scalia and I became friends, not despite our disagreements, but because of our disagreements, which led various organizations to invite us to debate each other, which we did in many interesting events all over the world, literally. As far away as New Zealand and Britain and Hawaii, among other places. And as is true of every human being I have ever met, we have some strong areas of disagreement on issues that we are very important to us, but we also have some strong areas of agreement on issues that are important to us. In Scalia's case, for example, he was a great defender of free speech, with one notable exception, which we respectfully debated, on sexually oriented expression, along with many traditional conservatives who wanted the government to have power to censor obscenity or pornography. But I digress. I'm going into the substantive issues. He just, what are the qualities that you look for in somebody who becomes a friend of yours, Stanley? It may be slightly different for each of us, but basically somebody with whom you have a personal rapport, somebody you respect, somebody you enjoy spending time with, somebody who is interesting, somebody from whom you can learn a lot, including different perspectives, somebody who shows that he's willing to learn from you, including different perspectives, and somebody who is, in his case, very warm, very charming, great sense of humor, and a sense of adventure, right? So one could share experiences together beyond discussing or debating legal issues. I am fully familiar with the surveys that you mentioned that show that there is an increasing tendency for people to not want to engage at all with people whose ideas they disagree with politically. And the Cato Institute did another survey last summer, which was together with another organization, which showed that people even supported firing fellow employees if they had given money to the opposite political candidate. So, Trump supporters thought that co-workers who had made donations to, I guess, it was referring back to the prior election, Trump voters who had thought that people who had made contributions to Hillary should be fired and vice versa. And that's so antithetical to our whole national idea, e pluribus unum, one out of many, to pluralism. It's so antithetical to democracy, as we see writ large in the United States Congress, where there are all too few members of Congress who are willing to speak to and negotiate with people on the other side of the aisle.
How can we begin to reconcile our differences and perhaps go towards that idea of, as Joe Biden would say, unifying this country? I don't believe that it could be the president on his own saying, let's unify it. I don't think he has that kind of power, nor 50% of the people in this country either don't like him or disagree with him. So they'll probably not go along with it. How can we begin to unify as a nation again?
Precisely because there has been so much attention to and concern about the increasing polarization. There are so many efforts, including at the grassroots level. You're completely right. This cannot be done and mandated in some top-down fashion. It really has to come at the individual level, at the community level, all over the country. And there are many, many initiatives on campus and in society at large to bridge these divides using various strategies, including literally bringing people together who want to talk about difficult issues with people who disagree with them, who are hungering to have the opportunity to meet and get to know people from different backgrounds. And a friend and colleague of mine, Jonathan Rauch, has a new book out which has a whole chapter that gives examples of the many, many such organizations. To mention just a couple, one on whose board he serves is called Better Angels, which organizes these initiatives in communities around the country. Another one is called Bridge, or Bridge USA. It started on campus at Berkeley a number of years ago and has spread to other campuses where groups of students and faculty members get together to discuss the most contentious issues with people who have different perspectives. Other organizations include one that I'm involved with. It's called the Heterodox Academy. That aims to enhance the presence and discussion by and with people who have a whole range of political perspectives on campus, which by and large have tilted extremely far to the left, especially in certain fields. And Heterodox Academy's purpose is a truth-seeking one. That studies show that you're going to get better social science results in every field if you have people with different perspectives who are evaluating and criticizing and each other's work. And so even just from the perspective of how do we get the best social science analysis and data, forget about human relations, just from a truth-seeking perspective, we've got to address these problems. So there's a lot going on, and for people who are interested, they can easily find resources very close to home.
Um, I wanted to ask this question in the beginning, and I guess I'll ask it now. It's a little bit of a change of pace, but why did you decide to go into the legal profession?
I went to law school when I graduated from college way back in 1968. Sorry, 1972. I graduated from high school in 68. And at that point, when I graduated from high school, I had no thought of becoming a lawyer at all. And this really says a lot about how history has changed in positive ways. When I graduated from high school, Stanley, I had never met a single woman lawyer. And there were extremely few women lawyers or law students in those days. that started to change very slowly, but it did change while I was in college. So for the first time, it really seemed like a field that was realistically open to women. And I was very involved in various civil rights, human rights causes, including the anti-war movement, the free speech movement, women's rights, reproductive freedom. And I increasingly saw that law would be a tool for advancing those causes. The phrase that was very common at the time was law as a vehicle for social change. You were just starting to see the fruits of significant campaigns for legal change by the ACLU, the NAACP, some environmental organizations were newly formed to advocate for environmental protection. And we had a large segment of students going to law school in those days in order to be law reform kind public interest lawyers. And many of us did pursue careers in public interest law. And if I do say so, collectively, we did put a big stamp upon the law and did move it in many different ways, including toward more gender equality.
You, I read that you practiced law for about 9 years and then you became a professor. What was the reasoning behind that move?
I had never intended to become a professor at all. I didn't particularly like law school. That's an understatement. I hated law school. I
Wait, can I
just,
interrupt? Sorry, can I interrupt? Why did you hate law school?
I was about to say,
Oh, sorry.
no, don't worry. Law school back then was very different from how law school is now. I think if I went to law school today, I would enjoy it a lot. But back then, the prestigious law schools in particular were staffed by faculty members who had virtually no practice background at all. They would go straight from being top students at the top law school to clerking for a couple prestigious judges, justices, maybe put in a year or two at a fancy Washington or Wall Street firm, but very, very quickly go into teaching. And many of them had literally no practice experience at all and really looked down on anybody who practiced law. They were masters of grand theory, were more interested in relating to the philosophy department or the history department than they were to practicing lawyers or judges. They were just beginning to have a couple clinical courses that would actually expose law students to practitioner skills. But where I went to school at the time, there was only one such clinic. It was always oversubscribed, so I didn't get in. In other words, I hated law school because it didn't really have much, if anything, to do with actually practicing law. I just wanted to hold my nose, get through with it, and start to learn on the job by actually practicing law. So if you had told me that I would end up being a law professor, I would have absolutely scoffed. Now, when you hear how I became a law professor, you'll understand how it fits together. I was in private practice, really enjoying developing my litigation skills on a range of interesting cases. And I was a very active pro bono or volunteer lawyer with ACLU, which is where my heart was. But I wasn't quite ready to become a full-time staff lawyer for the ACLU. I liked the independence of being a volunteer. Then a law school classmate of mine who was on the faculty at NYU Law School, which had by then developed a fantastic clinical program, one of the best in the country with many, many, many different clinics, including a civil rights clinic, contacted me and said, "We have an opening in our civil rights clinic. Would you like to teach it?" And I thought, well, this is heaven. I can give students the kind of experience that I never had when I was in law school, and I can simultaneously be handling ACLU cases and other civil rights cases full time without being on staff and having the independence of not being on staff. So that was a match made in heaven. Once I started teaching, which I really, really enjoyed, a faculty colleague at NYU reached out to me to co-author an article with him that he was writing on an issue that he knew the ACLU was doing some litigation about, and I would have some interest and some knowledge. So I co-authored the law review article, and I really enjoyed that. And I saw, wow, this isn't the kind of theoretical scholarship that my professors were engaged in. This is really going to have impact on policy the way a lawyer's brief would. So I fell in love with legal research and scholarship on issues that are of concern to me. And when I had the opportunity to teach constitutional law, which is my great passion, I leapt at that opportunity.
What do you enjoy most about teaching?
To me, everything I do, Stanley, is part of a single unified effort, which I would describe as education. I wouldn't even separate my advocacy from education. Advocacy is a form of education. You are educating a particular audience about a particular perspective. And I really do think that learning information and analysis and ideas, and then presenting them to various audiences, whether the audience is a law school seminar that you're teaching, whether the audience is a very well-informed podcast host who is interviewing you, whether the audience is a court before which you're presenting an argument or a legislative hearing before which you are testifying, you are trying to present the most pertinent information in the most persuasive way that will help bring your audience to wherever you want them to be. In a classroom, it's to stimulate their thinking, their questioning, their own ideas. Obviously, in a courtroom, it's to persuade the judge to rule a certain way, and so forth. And what I really love about this unified effort is that I'm constantly learning myself, learning, every time I prepare for or engage in any presentation, whether it be a class or whether it be an argument, a podcast. I'm always learning more on my own and then learning more as a result of the interaction with the other participants. So for those of us who love ideas, who are open-minded and are always trying to question our own prior conceptions, this is the ideal life.
Yeah. Um, what advice would you give to a person that is thinking about becoming a lawyer, or to a person just, starting their career? I think maybe it's a two-part question. Maybe it's separate advice, or um, maybe it's the same advice to both.
Was the second part of the question specifically about a legal career, or was it about a
I
career in
think that, well, regardless, one of them is about a
what?
legal career, and the other one is just a career in general.
Okay. So for anybody who is thinking of going to law school, if the question is, should you actually go to law school? Um, I would say it's a very expensive, very demanding process, legal education. And even students who did very well in college sometimes are flummoxed by how challenging law school is and how much work it takes and how much money it takes, even at state law schools. So you really should have a commitment. And that doesn't mean, obviously, you can't tell in advance that you're going to enjoy doing something in particular with your law degree, but you should have some basis for knowing that you're interested in the subject matter. You think that there are opportunities for lawyers that would be of interest to you. You're not just doing it as kind of lack of anything more specific that you want to do. And I think if you're not sure, there's absolutely no problem taking time off. I knew that I wanted to go to law school, and for that reason, I worked as a legal secretary while I was in college, and I worked as a legal secretary between college and law school. Uh, I had great secretarial skills that I had taught myself, and I was given a lot of paralegal type duties, and that was a really good way of testing my hypothesis that I was interested in a legal career. So students could do that today. They could work as a paralegal, do volunteer work with a legal organization. Then my advice after you get the degree, and here I'm going to speak specifically to lawyers, is uh, please be sure to keep looking for a job that is satisfying to you personally. The range of opportunities that open up with a law degree is literally infinite. I mean, people hire because it is such a rigorous education. People with a law school degree are hired for all kinds of positions that don't directly have to do with law at all, including in business, including in consulting, including in education, including in government. So you should definitely, and even within a particular field, just say you like practicing law, delivering services to clients, there are different firms can have different emphases in terms of subject matter areas, different clientele. Please keep looking until you find what is the right fit for you. Don't just, if you end up with a job that doesn't give you personal satisfaction, don't assume that it's the legal profession that is wrong. It's a very diverse profession. Look for other opportunities within it or other opportunities outside of the legal profession where your law degree can provide helpful background. I would also say, as part of that, you have a responsibility and an opportunity to use your law degree to promote the public good. I think all lawyers should either do some pro bono legal work in whatever field is of concern or interest to them, or to be involved in their communities, you know, community organizations, local government, again, because of the great training and skills that lawyers develop both in law school and beyond. We tend to be in great demand for a whole host of civic and community organizations. It could be, you know, serving on the board of a music institution. I mean, it could be something that doesn't have directly to do with law, but your legal skills will be valuable. And I say you have this opportunity. It's a great way to enrich your life, to go beyond the four corners of whatever your prime paid job is.
Wonderful. The last two questions I ask of all my guests, um, one, and I'm going to give you both, answer in whatever order you please. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? And the second one is, what are 5 books on any topic, fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Oh, wow. I should have written down those questions. I know you emailed them to me. The first one is easy. The second one is going to be, I'll just have to do it off the top of my head. Um, so, what gives me hope for the future, Stanley, is young people like you and the many students that I'm constantly meeting in my own classes and in my public presentations. And I have to include very young students as well. I speak not only to law school and college audiences, but also to high school and middle school. And I've had just some really extraordinary, inspiring interactions with very young people who are so knowledgeable, so interested, so interesting, who are really committed to using their skills and abilities and passions toward making the world a better place. So I'm very happy to and confident to pass the torch of liberty to much younger generations. Now, in terms of 5 books that I would recommend, and so please, audience and Stanley, understand this is very random. I read constantly. On my phone, I subscribe to Audible, and last time I looked, I had almost 2,000 Audible books in the phone, you know, that I had bought. Just so.
Oh, that's a
Uh,
lot.
yeah, and plus I read, you know, the old-fashioned kind of books as
Yeah.
well. So let me give you two classics, and then I'll see where my imagination takes me. But in terms of classics on the topic of free speech, I would certainly recommend John Stuart Mill on liberty. I reread that every few years, and it always stands the test of time. It's so pertinent, so persuasive. The last time I reread it, I focused on something that I hadn't really realized before. And it goes back to the question you were asking, Stanley, about cancel culture. Right at the beginning of that book, which Mill wrote in 1859, right? And he co-wrote it with his wife, Harriet Taylor. That's a really important point that many people don't recognize. He even delayed the publication because she had become ill and he was waiting for her to recover to do a final read, to give her final approval to it. And sadly, she died. So she was really a co-author by his own standards. And if you look at the dedication, he makes that very clear in the dedication to the book. But right at the beginning, after that dedication, he says that this is a book that is talking about the greatest threat to free speech in our era. He's referring to 19th century, mid 19th century Britain. And it's not the government, it's peer pressure and it's social pressure. So he was discussing what we now call cancel culture, and you really understand what a serious threat it is to true freedom. So I highly recommend that. As another evergreen, I mean, this sounds corny and predictable, but every time I reread it, I see something new in it, and that's 1984 by George Orwell. He was so amazingly prescient. I'd say just as Mill's classic is the um, best work on free speech. If I had to choose one, I would say Orwell's is the best if I had to choose one on privacy, because when you think about it, the power that Big Brother wields to completely suppress not only liberty, but indeed individuality, it's not any kind of heavy handed censorship. It's certainly not torture or brutality. It is simply the knowledge that Big Brother is always watching. So he really drives home the fact that pervasive surveillance completely decimates individual liberty and dignity, indeed individuality altogether. Another evergreen, I think I already mentioned Jonathan Rauch, Rauch. He wrote a real classic book about 30 years ago called The Kindly Inquisitors, which came out with a new edition and an updated forward or afterward more recently. It is, I think, the single best explanation of the necessity for intellectual freedom and the dangers of what is often called political correctness or cancel culture. So those are three. If I go beyond that, I would say Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I love novels. I love 19th century novels. And I particularly love the writings of Dickens and George Eliot and Anthony Trollope, because they dealt with not only issues of individual people and the interactions and human relations among people, but also with social and political issues. So he wrote so many novels about the British political system and the clerical, politics of the church, which were very important. Eliot and Dickens were very committed to social justice, and Bleak House in particular. And let me throw in another one by Dickens, Little Dorrit, are very, very pertinent. Bleak House is a real assault on the worst aspects of litigation and the court system, which are true to this day in our country as well. But Dickens always has a hopeful note. I think he's basically an optimist, as I am too. You can't be an activist without being an optimist. Little Dorrit is about debtor's prison. And again, the injustices that take place toward people who are economically deprived, how that then is builds into deprivation of access to equal justice, something that is particularly resonant today when we've had so much information and finally some reform about how the money bail system really just penalizes people for being poor and keeps them in prison just for being poor. So it's sadly resonant even, many years later and in a different country. So that gives me only one left. Oh my goodness. Let me say, I'll just give an example of I always read multiple books at the same time. Right now, one of the books that I have just finished was the latest in a series called 44th Scotland Road by, oh my goodness, famous Scottish writer who also, I'm so bad at names, as I've told you. He also wrote a series called about a detective in Africa. Let me go to my library here and I can look it up if I can find it. Alexander McCall Smith. And what's interesting about him is he is a lawyer and a law professor. And but he doesn't really directly talk about legal issues. He talks a lot about issues of jurisprudence and moral philosophy, but through the vehicle of a really interesting, diverse array of quirky, eccentric, lovable, irritating characters, just like the people we know in our own lives, but using them in a very low-keyed, entertaining, heartwarming way to explore the most challenging issues like the meaning of life.
Uh, that's a wonderful list. I want to say I'm extremely lucky to do this podcast, and I'm lucky that I get to speak to people like you all the time. And it's an honor to have you on the podcast, and I want to thank you for coming on and taking the time to speak with me. I want to recommend your book um, that I have right here, and I want to, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Stanley. And as I say, you're one of the really inspiring, impressive young people who give me hope. So many thanks to you.
Thank you.
Take care.